He bought a house for a new start, but behind the walls, someone had sealed a danger that could have killed him. A greedy contractor and a careless inspector cut corners and buried the truth, thinking no one would ever find out. But one dog's warning and one man's refusal to ignore it turned silence into action. And just wait until you see how justice cracked through the lies and why this story ends exactly the way it should. Ryan Buckley hadn't planned on settling down in a small Ohio town. But when the listing popped up, a modest craftsman-style house on Maple Street priced just low enough to seem almost suspicious, he made the call. By the end of that week, he'd signed the deed with hands still covered in drywall dust from the third construction gig that month. It wasn't just a house, it was a reset button. The place wasn't much to look at. Fresh coat of neutral gray paint over old bones, laminate flooring that clicked when you walked too fast, and a lingering smell of synthetic lemon from the realtor's open house candles. There were no frills, no charm, no architectural quirks that would drive up the price. But there were walls, a roof, and, most importantly, no shared tenants or bad memories. To a man like Ryan, who'd spent years drifting from job sites to rental rooms, that was priceless. June, the shepherd mix he'd adopted from a rescue shelter 2 years back, didn't seem entirely sold. As soon as she stepped into the front room, her body tensed. Not with fear exactly, but with the kind of alertness that only animals exhibit when they sense something off. Still, she followed Ryan from room to room, tail low, ears perked, moving with the kind of care you'd expect from a patrol dog doing a sweep. That first night, the storm rolled in slow. Classic Midwest drama. The kind of rain that tapped insistently against the windows without ever demanding panic. Somewhere in the distance, a train mourned its way across the tracks, just like it would every night after. Ryan fell asleep with June curled near his feet and the sound of raindrops acting like a lullaby. Until exactly 2:13 a.m. That's when June moved. He didn't wake because of a noise or a creak or even the storm. He woke because the dog beside him suddenly went rigid, her muscles locked tight, her ears pointing forward like twin arrows. Without a bark or whine, she rose and padded softly out of the bedroom. Ryan sat up and listened. Nothing. Then a low, steady growl, deep and uncertain, began to echo from the hallway. He stepped into the dim light and saw her there, frozen at the edge of the dining room, her gaze locked on a particular patch of wall. Not the window, not the baseboard, not the corner shadows where old houses sometimes groan. She was barking directly at the center of the wall, just painted drywall like any other, smooth and unremarkable. Except to her. "June," he said gently, still groggy, "come on, girl, it's an old place. Pipes, mice, maybe even squirrels in the attic." He tried to laugh, a soft, breathy sound, as if saying it out loud could make it less odd. But June didn't move. He turned on the light. The plaster gleamed like it always had. No holes, no marks, no movement, just silence. He pressed his palm against the wall, half expecting a draft or a vibration. It was cool, solid. June's eyes never left the surface. A slow growl trembled in her chest, the kind that doesn't come from aggression, but from unease. That was the first time Ryan felt it, that strange, intangible sensation that something wasn't quite right. Not dangerous, not yet, but off in a way that only dogs and gut instincts know how to recognize. The next morning, he stepped out onto the porch, still turning the memory over in his head like a stone he couldn't get a good grip on. The sky had cleared, and the air was thick with that warm, earthy scent after rainfall. Nora Ellison from across the street appeared with 2 mugs of coffee, one already doctored with too much creamer, just how Ryan liked it. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed and silver-haired, the kind of neighbor who knew everything about everyone without ever needing to gossip. "So, how was your first night?" she asked, not unkindly, but with a lilt of caution. Ryan took a sip of the coffee and gave a small nod. Quiet enough,
June barked at shadows once, but old house noises, you know. Nora's gaze slid past him toward the front window. "This place was empty a long time," she said quietly. "Couple years. Not that you'd know it from the outside now. Contractor from Dayton flipped it. Quick work. Too quick, if you ask me." Ryan tilted his head. "Something wrong with it?" Nora hesitated, then shrugged in that way people do when they don't want to say too much, but also don't want to be blamed later for staying silent. "Let's just say folks on this street heard strange things during the renovation. Lights on at odd hours, work going on past midnight, a generator thumping in the yard when the sun wasn't up yet." He frowned. "Inspector cleared it." "That's what makes it strange," Nora said, wrapping her hands tighter around her cup. "Passed on the first try, no red flags, which, around here, is rare." Ryan didn't have the luxury to dwell. His mortgage bill was already scheduled, and the leftover savings barely covered basic repairs if anything went wrong. He smiled politely and thanked her for the coffee. But inside, something had shifted. June wouldn't stop pacing the hallway. Over the next few hours, she kept returning to the exact same spot in the dining room, sniffing, backing off, returning again, tail stiff and head low, like she was bracing for a sound no one else could hear. Her eyes didn't look scared. They looked focused, like she was waiting for something to move. Ryan stood in the room with her that evening, silence pressing in like insulation. He stared at the same section of wall, trying to see whatever it was that had June on edge. It looked plain, just paint and nails and studs behind plaster. Nothing to see, nothing to smell, nothing to fear. But dogs don't bark at nothing. And some walls are built not just to hold up ceilings, but to hide what shouldn't be found.
The storm arrived like something from a different world. Late in the evening, as Ryan rinsed dinner plates and June watched the window with uneasy stillness, the sky shifted from dusk to a sickly green haze. It wasn't just overcast. It was the color of old bruises and bad news, the kind of sky that made even the street lamps hesitate before flickering on. By midnight, the wind had grown teeth. It clawed at the maple trees lining the street, turning their leaves inside out in great silver sheets. The rain came in bursts, like it couldn't decide if it was meant to cleanse or warn. Thunder rolled, not the sharp crack of a summer storm, but deep, layered crashes, as if something enormous were dragging itself through the clouds, furniture scraping across heaven. Ryan sat on the couch, half watching the muted TV, while June paced the hallway in widening loops. She wouldn't settle. Every few minutes, she stopped by the dining room and stood motionless, ears trained, nose tilted. She wasn't just alert, she was tracking something. At 1:09 a.m., the lights flickered. A brief, breathless pause. Then everything went dark. Ryan stood, more annoyed than afraid. "Breaker again," he muttered, and stepped into the hallway, grabbing the small flashlight he kept clipped near the kitchen door. He hadn't taken 2 steps before June exploded. She launched forward with a violent, guttural bark that echoed like a warning shot down the hallway. Her claws scrambled against the floorboards as she hurled herself toward the dining room, every muscle in her body lit with urgency. The sound wasn't defensive, it wasn't playful, it was panic. That was the moment the wall moved. At first, it was subtle, a tremble, like the house exhaling in a way it hadn't before. Then a sharp, wet crack opened up along the fresh seam of paint in the dining room wall. Not a corner, not a window frame. Dead center, right where June had been focused for days. The split widened like a grin held too long. A brittle creak sounded from deep inside the wall, and then, suddenly, violently, the whole upper section of the wall buckled outward. Plaster cracked like ice on a lake and folded forward in a plume of dust, collapsing in one loud, choking breath. A snowstorm of gypsum and powder exploded into the air. Ryan staggered backward, one arm shielding his face.
His heart was hammering. Through the settling cloud, he saw June at the edge of the collapse, growling low, her teeth bared at the dark, jagged opening now exposed in the wall. And what he saw inside that wall made his breath catch. It wasn't insulation. It wasn't wiring. It wasn't a forgotten panel or storage nook. It was a hidden chamber. A narrow, claustrophobic alcove, barely the width of a coat closet, framed with makeshift furring strips and thin plywood. Someone had sealed it deliberately, not for structure or storage, but to keep it hidden. Inside, tangled like a careless afterthought, lay a hacked run of flexible gas line, snaking loosely through the cavity and leading to a capped T-joint. There was no shutoff valve, no regulation venting, no protective wrap. The pipe bent slightly from pressure, like it had been forced into place. Bits of charred plywood were tacked along one side, their edges blackened and brittle. A stained vapor barrier sagged along the back, mottled with moisture and age. There was a box tucked into the corner, masks meant for construction dust, their filters yellowed and flaking. And on the subfloor, near the center of the cavity, a child's sticker, faded, red, a kite. The kind that once brightened the corner of a lunchbox or notebook, now mashed into the wood grain, as if someone had stepped on it in haste, deliberately grinding it down. Ryan took a shaky step back, nearly slipping on the powder that now coated the floor. That's when he heard it. The sharp, shrill whine of the carbon monoxide detector coming from the hallway. It wasn't screaming, it was pleading, thin, rapid, insistent. The air in his mouth tasted wrong, like metal, dry and bitter, like licking a handful of coins. He didn't need further explanation. Ryan spun around, tore open the front door, and dashed outside into the storm, June sprinting close behind. Rain hit his face like slaps, cold and hard. His hands fumbled with the wrench at the main gas shutoff. It took 3 tries to spin it closed. The moment the valve snapped into place, he stumbled back to the porch and sat down hard, soaked and shaken, lungs pulling in the clean, wet air like medicine. June pressed into his leg, not whimpering, not afraid, just there, never looking away from the gap in the wall. He sat like that for several minutes, chest heaving, mind scrambling to catch up. He should have called the contractor. He should have called the city. He should have done anything other than go back in. But when the storm pushed on and the sky lightened slightly, when the thunder grew distant and the walls of the house stopped creaking like they were about to speak, he did the only thing that felt like control. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped barefoot into the dining room. The cavity was silent. The smell of plaster dust hung in the air like old paper. When the beam of his flashlight swept across the opening, he saw the truth that made his blood chill even more than the gas line. The edges of the drywall weren't jagged or torn from age. They were sharp, clean, precise. The screw pattern was modern, tight, and uniform. Drywall tape smoothed and painted over just weeks ago. Whoever sealed that space had done it recently, purposefully, confident that no one would ever look too closely. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they had almost gotten away with it.
The morning after the wall came down, Ryan's hands were still trembling, but not from fear. That phase had passed. What replaced it was something quieter, colder, and more focused. Anger, yes, but not the kind that explodes. This was the kind that steadies your grip, the kind that turns confusion into clarity and fear into fuel. If the house had been a person, he thought, he would have checked for a pulse, looked for signs of life, signs of trauma, signs of history. He hadn't done that. He'd believed the brochure, the fresh paint, the warm staging, but now the plaster was down and the truth was visible. He started with the manila folder in the kitchen drawer, the one the realtor had handed him during closing. It contained the property documents, closing forms, inspection report, and a thin packet of city permits. He flipped through each page carefully. At the top of the construction forms, Holt Renovations, LLC. Signed off by Glenn Avery, the city's assigned building inspector. Ryan remembered the name. Glenn had been at the signing, all friendly smiles and two firm handshakes, the kind of guy who wore his town softball shirt under his county-issued windbreaker. But something didn't add up. The gas line wasn't on any of the approved blueprints. No mention of rerouting. No notes about repairs to internal ventilation. And nowhere was the alcove listed. Not as a closet, not as storage, not even as dead space. That sealed cavity didn't legally exist. Ryan drove out of town, past rusted mailboxes and farmland cracked from sun, until he reached a gravel lot just off Route 4. A bent metal sign marked the yard. Holt Renovations, LLC. We Build Trust. Travis Holt met him in front of a steel-clad office, tall and lean, wearing a high-vis vest over a polo shirt. His expression was neutral, almost polished, like a man used to dealing with confrontation using charm instead of answers. Ryan didn't bother with pleasantries. "I found a gas line hidden behind a sealed wall," he said, holding up a printed photo of the cavity. "Unvented, improperly capped, and not a single mention of it in the plans you filed." Travis blanked, then shrugged with both hands in the air. "Hidden condition," he said, casually, as if they were talking about a hairline in drywall. "We fix what we can see. That flip was a charity case anyway. Margins were paper thin. Honestly, we barely broke even." "You built a coffin for a spark," Ryan said, voice low. For a moment, something flickered in Travis's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But it vanished quickly, replaced with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We had inspectors," he said. "If Glenn passed it, it's passed." That answer didn't sit right. Ryan called Glenn Avery that same afternoon. The inspector answered on the third ring with the relaxed tone of someone who didn't yet know what was about to be uncovered. "I remember that house," Glenn said. "Everything met code at the time." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even a defense. It was routine, the kind of vague response you give when you've said the same line too many times. "If you're worried," Glenn added, "hire your own guy to come look." Ryan hung up slowly. There's a type of anger that hits when you realize someone endangered you through laziness. But there's another type that burns longer, when you realize they knew. That someone cut corners and just expected no one to look behind the walls. He wasn't a man who raised his voice, but he knew how to take the right next step. Ryan filed a formal complaint with the State Building Authority, then another with the gas utility, including detailed photos of the illegal line, the cavity, and the compromised materials. He attached a copy of the inspection paperwork and highlighted every missing detail. Then he walked across the street to Nora Ellison's house. Nora listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded slowly, stood up from her chair, and returned with her phone. No hesitation, no disclaimers. She pulled up a series of videos, grainy, time-stamped clips taken over several nights. From her upstairs window, you could see Holt's crew working behind taped-up plastic, lights shining in the house well past midnight, a generator humming in the yard long after most people had gone to bed, a delivery truck pulling up under the cover of darkness, unloading sheet goods through a side door. "I didn't want to say anything before," she said, voice soft, "but I'm tired of pretending I didn't see what I saw." Ryan copied everything to a flash drive. He added it to the complaint. Later that night, he was in the hallway when June started sniffing along the baseboards, persistent, tail low, ears perked. She kept returning to one section beneath an old heating vent. After a few nudges, the panel popped free with a dry creak.
Behind it was a small cavity leading into the wall, completely sealed from the inside. A ventilation shaft long bricked over. The mortar looked fresh. Inside the space, beneath the dust and insulation fragments, Ryan found something strange. A crumpled grocery receipt from a store just outside Dayton. The date, 6 months ago. Scribbled in bold black marker along the margin were 4 words. Move gas, hide crack. No initials, no signature, just that. Like a checklist someone had written in a hurry. He stood there for a long time, staring at that note, letting the weight of it settle in. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't poor craftsmanship. It was a decision, intentional, concealed, and calculated. Ryan scanned the receipt, photographed everything, and added it to the case file. Then he submitted it all to the state investigator assigned to his complaint. And then he waited. Which, in some ways, is the hardest part. When the shock has passed, the facts are filed, and the paperwork is in someone else's hands, but the house you trusted still stands there, quiet and heavy, like it's holding in secrets. The dining room felt different now. It wasn't just a space. It was a witness. Ryan sat on the floor that night, June curled beside him, watching the wind shift the trees outside. He didn't feel safe, not yet, but he felt something else beginning to build in his chest. Not fear, resolve. The kind that doesn't fade when the headlines disappear. The kind that waits, watches, and makes sure the truth can't be buried behind another wall.
Fear didn't knock on the door or crash through the window. It seeped in quietly, like water through old concrete. Silent, steady, and hard to trace until it had already settled in every room. In the days that followed the discovery behind the dining room wall, Ryan found himself second-guessing everything he once trusted about the house. The layout he'd memorized now felt unfamiliar. The corners that once held shadows now seemed to hold breath. Even the sunlight that spilled across the living room in the late afternoon, it felt wrong, too bright, like it was overcompensating for something it couldn't fix. He flinched whenever the furnace kicked on. The once comforting sound of airflow had become a warning. Each mechanical hum made his shoulders rise. Was that just warm air or pressure building where it shouldn't be? He moved differently now. Boots always at the foot of the bed, laces loose for speed. A hammer rested by the nightstand, not for repairs, but for reasons he didn't dare name. Not yet. June had changed too. She patrolled the house with a rhythm that was no longer random. Every few hours she made a circuit. Living room, kitchen, hallway, dining room, then paused by the sealed chimney vent, nose close, tail stiff. She didn't bark anymore. She listened. She studied the vents like they were whispering. And Ryan listened with her. The house had grown too quiet. No more settling sounds. No more creaks or sighs in the walls. Just silence, watchful and tense, like something was waiting. Then, 2 nights later, the waiting ended. It happened at 2:41 a.m. A low, muted thump, barely audible, rolled beneath the floorboards. At first, Ryan thought it was thunder. Then the crawl space below them gave a subtle, sickening heave, lifting the center of the room half an inch before letting it drop with a tired, reluctant pop. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Before he could process it, June was at his side, barking, not frantically, but urgently. She pushed her body against his legs, nudging him down the hall, toward the front door. Not guiding, driving. His brain lagged behind his instincts, but his feet moved. He grabbed the flashlight and wrench in one motion and threw open the front door, cutting across the lawn in bare feet to the shutoff valve. The wrench bit the metal, squealing as he twisted. The gas line stopped hissing with a faint sigh. His fingers were numb as he dialed 911. When the fire crew arrived, their truck lights painted the house in blue and white, and the team moved quickly but quietly, like they knew not to trust anything too still.
The lieutenant, a square-jawed man with soot in the lines of his uniform, entered the crawl space with 2 others and a thermal camera. When he emerged, his expression had changed. "You were close," he said, no panic in his voice, just something worse, certainty. "There's a sagging joist under the dining room, held up with scrap lumber that wouldn't pass code in a garden shed. Heat signature behind the chimney wall, small but climbing." He looked Ryan dead in the eye. "Another few hours and you'd have had a fire inside the wall." Ryan swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, but not from thirst. "Where's your contractor?" the lieutenant asked. Ryan didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. An hour later, the state investigator arrived. She wore a slate gray suit jacket over work boots, her posture both precise and unfazed. She moved through the house like someone who'd seen too many stories that started this way. Calm, firm, without judgment, but also without surprise. She scraped samples from the bricked-over vent, took photos of the scorched beam beneath the joist. And when Ryan handed her the crumpled receipt he'd found weeks earlier, the one with the ominous scrawl, she didn't blink. Her voice was flat and even, like reading from a ledger. Someone concealed a structural crack, rerouted a gas line, hid it behind a sealed cavity. No permit, no ventilation, no safety measures. She turned to Ryan. They didn't fix the house, they staged it, to survive a walkthrough, not a second storm. Ryan didn't know what to say, because she was right. They hadn't just cut corners, they'd written an entire false history and stapled it behind clean drywall. That night, he didn't sleep inside the house. He and June curled up in the cab of his truck, parked under the maple tree at the edge of the driveway. Rain tapped softly on the roof, and the wind hissed through the grass. The warmth from June's body helped, but not enough. The fear didn't shout, it pressed. What if the mortgage swallowed what was left of his savings? What if the structure, rot hidden under polish, was a lemon he couldn't sell, couldn't fix, couldn't walk away from? What if June hadn't barked that first night? What if he'd gone one more day, one more storm, without knowing? His jaw clenched as he stared at the dark shape of the house through the windshield. His fist stayed closed most of the night, even in sleep. He didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted, worn down by the silence of systems that were supposed to protect him, by the weight of a truth no one else had to carry. But he stayed. He stayed because the truth mattered now more than ever. He stayed because no one else would fix this if he didn't. He wasn't fearless. He was afraid, and he stayed anyway. There's a difference.
Acceptance didn't come all at once. It wasn't a dramatic realization or some cinematic breakthrough. It came slowly, in careful steps, each one grounded in action. Not surrender, not forgiveness, but movement. Ryan learned that acceptance wasn't the same as letting things go. It was recognizing what he could change and what he had to face head on. The first sign that the truth had begun to matter beyond his 4 walls came from the county records office. A stop work order issued on every active project under Holt Renovations, LLC. Permits were frozen. Inspectors were reassigned. The official stamp of approval, once handed out like a handshake, was now treated with the caution it deserved. Then came the news. Glenn Avery, the city inspector who had signed off on Ryan's house without a second glance, had resigned before the ethics board hearing even began. No dramatic statement, no apology, just an empty desk and a sealed letter. It didn't fix Ryan's ceiling. It didn't repair the floor joists, but it meant something. It meant the weight of Glenn's signature had finally tipped the wrong scale. Within weeks, a grand jury convened and formal charges were filed. Falsified permits, reckless endangerment, and failure to disclose hazards. The system, once silent, had begun to speak. Ryan got the call from Travis Holt's lawyer on a Wednesday. The voice on the other end was rehearsed and polite. The message was clear. A settlement offer, structured like compensation, delivered like an apology no one had the courage to speak aloud.
It was money, enough to fix what mattered, but not so much it admitted guilt. Ryan didn't hesitate. He accepted. Because he'd already learned something no contract could offer. Lawsuits are storms that last longer than roofs. He used the money with precision, no shortcuts, no half measures. He hired a team the old way, through referrals, not ads. Licensed, meticulous professionals, the kind who carried chalk lines like sacred tools and argued passionately over fractions of inches. Men and women who respected what homes were meant to be, shelter, not risk. Together, they opened up every wall that felt too quiet. They tore back the drywall with care, revealing the bones of a house that had been rushed into hiding. They replaced every rotted stud, every suspect junction, and ran pressure tests on the entire gas system until it sang like it should have from day one. The bricked-over chimney was restored, not hidden. They reconnected the home structure not just to the building code, but to the truth, the one that had been buried under plaster and silence. And June watched it all. She sunbathed in rectangles of morning light that now fell onto safe floors. When the noise of drills or saws grew too loud, she'd walk quietly to Ryan, rest her chin on his knee, and wait until his breathing slowed. He didn't speak about it, but he knew what she was doing. She was reminding him the storm was over. On the final day, when the drywall crew finished the last clean panel and packed up their gear, Ryan walked into the dining room, the place where this had all begun. He knelt at the baseboard where the illegal cavity had once sat and pressed a small brass plate into the wood. The engraving was simple, quiet. Here, we learned to listen. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It didn't groan with secrets. It breathed, honest and solid. Nora stopped by with a tray of brownies and news about the block. For the first time, her updates felt like ordinary neighborhood chatter, not quiet warnings in disguise. The fire lieutenant who had first caught the heat bloom in the wall dropped by one afternoon with a broad smile and scratched June behind the ears. "Best inspector we've seen all year," he said. Ryan laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt earned. He understood the choices now. Not forgave them, but understood them. Travis Holt had been cornered by debt, working under pressure, making decisions with fear in both hands. He didn't build to deceive, not at first. He built to survive. Then he learned how to hide. Glenn Avery had made peace with looking the other way. Maybe not out of malice, maybe out of habit. Maybe because, after a while, the math of cutting corners starts to feel normal when the numbers work. But buildings don't lie. They keep the record. They remember. And when the paint chips away, they tell everything. Now, the house stood tall, not because it was perfect, but because nothing inside it was hidden anymore. The furnace clicked on in the evenings, warm and steady, and Ryan didn't flinch. June curled on the rug near the dining room wall, quiet, alert, only in the way a dog should be. No barks, no ghosts, just peace. He used to think she'd barked at spirits, at something he couldn't see. But the truth was harder. She had been barking at the truth itself, at what had been buried inside the walls by people who thought no one would ever dig. And when the plaster gave and the lies came down, Ryan felt it all. The shock, the anger, the fear. But when the dust settled, what remained was clarity. Not the belief that the world was fair, but the belief that he could stand inside it with eyes open. Now, in the mornings, he sat with coffee at the new window seat, cut precisely into the wall where the false cavity once loomed. June rested nearby, her eyes following birds as they darted between maple trees. Across the street, a nail gun snapped in rhythm. Someone else was building something real. Light caught the brass plate in the corner and made it gleam. And in that quiet, safe space, Ryan finally understood what promise he'd made when he bought this house. It wasn't to escape his past. It was to become the kind of man who doesn't look away when the walls speak. And this time, he listened.